Good evening, everyone, and welcome to your favorite sleep channel, The Droning Professor. Tonight we're going to learn about Leonardo da Vinci. So, as you make yourselves comfortable, please take a moment to let us know where you're listening from and feel free to subscribe. Now, as always, take a moment for some deep breaths, letting your mind and body relax for a good night of sleep. Tonight, we're going to talk about a man who was born 572 years ago in a small Tuscan village, illegitimate, left-handed, probably dyslexic, and definitely unable to finish anything he started. And yet, somehow, this Renaissance catastrophe became the closest thing humanity has ever produced to an actual superhero. I'm talking, of course, about Leonardo da Vinci, a man so talented that when you Google Renaissance man, his picture literally comes up, which must be annoying for all the other Renaissance men who also worked really hard. Tonight, we're going to talk about a man who was born 572 years ago in a small Tuscan village, illegitimate, left-handed, probably dyslexic, likely gay, and definitely unable to finish anything he started. And yet, somehow, this Renaissance catastrophe became the closest thing humanity has ever produced to an actual superhero. I'm talking, of course, about Leonardo da Vinci, a man so talented that when you Google Renaissance man, his picture literally comes up, which must be annoying for all the other Renaissance men who also worked really hard. Leonardo was born on April 15th, 1452, in Vinci, a hillside town near Florence that was so small it didn't even have its own name attached to it. His full name, Leonardo di Ser Piero da Vinci, basically translates to Leonardo, son of Mr. Piero, from Vinci, which is the medieval equivalent of being named Bob, son of Robert, from Buffalo. His father, Ser Piero, was a notary, a respectable professional who wore fancy robes and dealt with contracts and legal documents. His mother, Caterina, was a peasant woman, possibly from the Middle East, though historians love to argue about this because apparently we can't just let Leonardo have anything without a committee meeting about it first. Now, being illegitimate in the 1500s wasn't quite the scandal it would become in later centuries, but it did mean Leonardo couldn't follow in his father's footsteps as a notary. You needed legitimate birth for that, which seems like an odd requirement for a job that's basically about writing things down, but that's guild rules for you. This accident of birth would shape Leonardo's entire life. He couldn't attend university. He couldn't join the prestigious professions. He was locked out of the formal education system that would have taught him Latin and Greek and all the classical texts that every educated person was supposed to know. And this, paradoxically, might have been the best thing that ever happened to him. See, while all the legitimate kids were sitting in stuffy rooms conjugating Latin verbs and memorizing Aristotle, Leonardo was outside, looking at things. Actually looking at them. Watching how water flows around rocks in a stream. Observing how light hits a leaf. Noticing the way muscles move under skin. He became an obsessive observer of nature, and because he hadn't been taught what the ancient authorities said about these things, he didn't have their assumptions cluttering up his brain. He looked at the world with fresh eyes, and he trusted what he saw more than what books told him he should see. This was revolutionary. This was science before we really had a word for science. When Leonardo was about 14 or 15, his father managed to apprentice him to Andrea del Verrocchio, one of the leading artists in Florence. This was 1466 or 1467, and Florence was basically the Silicon Valley of the Renaissance. The Medici family was running the show, money was flowing, and if you wanted to make it as an artist, Florence was the place to be. Verrocchio's workshop was a happening spot. It wasn't just about painting pretty pictures. These workshops were like combination art studios, engineering firms, and special effects houses. You learned sculpture, painting, metalwork, architecture, mathematics, mechanics, everything. It was less like art school and more like attending a Renaissance version of MIT, except with better fashion and worse hygiene. Leonardo absorbed everything. He learned to grind pigments, prepare panels, cast bronze, design buildings, and paint in the style of his master. But even as an apprentice, he was showing signs of being special. There's a famous story, probably apocryphal but too good not to tell, that Verrocchio was painting the baptism of Christ and asked young Leonardo to paint one of the angels. Leonardo's angel was so beautiful, so much better than anything else in the painting, that Verrocchio supposedly threw down his brushes and never painted again. Now, this story is almost certainly nonsense because Verrocchio kept right on painting, but it tells us something important. Even as a teenager, Leonardo was clearly extraordinary. By his mid-20s, Leonardo had qualified as a master in the Guild of St. Luke, which meant he could take on his own commissions and run his own workshop. But here's where we encounter the first major Leonardo problem. The man could not finish a project to save his life. It's actually impressive how consistently he failed to complete things. His first major independent commission, around 1481, was the Adoration of the Magi for a monastery. It was going to be magnificent. He did all these preparatory drawings, worked out this incredibly complex composition with the Virgin and Child in the center, and this swirling mass of humanity around them, horses rearing, wise men kneeling, architectural ruins in the background, the whole 9 yards. And then he just stopped, left it as an underpainting, and wandered off to Milan. The monks must have been thrilled. Ah, Milan. Leonardo moved there around 1482 or 1483, and he did so in the most Leonardo way possible. He wrote a letter to Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, basically a Renaissance resume, listing all the things he could do. And this letter is hilarious because of what it emphasizes. Leonardo spends about 9/10 of the letter talking about his skills as a military engineer. He can build portable bridges. He can design siege weapons. He knows how to divert rivers. He can build armored vehicles. Oh, and by the way, in peacetime he can do architecture and sculpture and painting too. No big deal. This is like Beyoncé applying for a job by saying, "I'm really good at filing and answering phones, but I can also carry a tune if needed." Ludovico hired him, though probably not for the military engineering. Leonardo spent about 17 years in Milan, from around 1482 to 1499, and these were incredibly productive years, at least by Leonardo's standards, which means he actually finished a few things. He was working as a sort of combination court artist, engineer, and party planner. He designed stage sets for elaborate theatrical productions. He painted portraits of Ludovico's mistresses. He worked on architectural projects. He started thinking seriously about human anatomy and mechanics and optics and mathematics, and basically everything else that caught his interest, which was everything. During these Milan years, Leonardo painted the Virgin of the Rocks, and more importantly, he painted the Last Supper. Let's talk about the Last Supper for a minute, because it's both a masterpiece and a disaster, which is very on brand for Leonardo. Ludovico commissioned him around 1495 to paint a mural in the dining hall of the monastery of Santa Maria delle Grazie. It was supposed to show the moment when Jesus announces that one of his disciples will betray him. Simple enough, right? But Leonardo couldn't just paint a normal fresco. No, that would be too straightforward. Fresco technique requires you to paint on wet plaster, working quickly in sections, and Leonardo didn't like working quickly. He liked to think. He liked to revise. He liked to stare at the wall for hours and then add one brush stroke. So he invented his own technique, painting on dry plaster with a mixture of tempera and oil, which gave him the flexibility to work slowly and make changes. Brilliant. Except for one tiny problem. His experimental technique wasn't stable. The paint started flaking off almost immediately. Within 20 years, people were already commenting on how badly it was deteriorating. Within 50 years, it was in terrible shape. Today, after multiple restorations, we're basically looking at a shadow of what Leonardo painted, and that's being generous. But even in its deteriorated state, Even after being bombed during World War II and repainted by well-meaning but not quite Leonardo-level restorers, The Last Supper is astounding. The composition is mathematically perfect. The perspective lines all converge on Jesus' head, making him the focal point. The 12 disciples are arranged in 4 groups of 3, creating a rhythm across the wall. Each figure has a distinct personality, a distinct reaction to Jesus' announcement. You can read their characters in their gestures, their expressions, their body language. This wasn't just a painting, it was a psychological drama frozen in time. Leonardo spent months observing people, sketching faces, watching how bodies move, all so he could capture this one moment with perfect authenticity. And the details! Leonardo was obsessed with details. There are stories about him wandering the streets of Milan, looking for the perfect face for Judas. He wanted someone who looked capable of betrayal, but not in a cartoonish villain way. Judas needed to look like a real person who would make a terrible choice. Leonardo reportedly spent so much time without painting anything that the prior of the monastery complained to Ludovico. Leonardo explained quite reasonably that he was working, just not with a brush. He was working with his mind, solving problems, figuring things out. The prior didn't understand this. Many people didn't understand this about Leonardo. They thought he was lazy or distracted. He wasn't. He was thinking, and for Leonardo, thinking was the work. While in Milan, Leonardo also started keeping notebooks. Oh, the notebooks! This is where Leonardo really comes alive for us, 5 centuries later. He filled thousands of pages with drawings, observations, ideas, questions, inventions, anatomical studies, mathematical calculations, jokes, shopping lists, everything. He wrote in mirror script, right to left, which people love to make a big deal about, suggesting it was some kind of code. It probably wasn't. He was left-handed. Mirror writing was more natural for him, and it kept him from smudging the ink. Mystery solved. Sorry, conspiracy theorists. These notebooks show us Leonardo's mind in action, and that mind was interested in absolutely everything. How do birds fly? How do muscles attach to bones? Why is the sky blue? Can you square a circle? What's the ideal proportion for a human body? How does water create vortices? Can you build a flying machine? What about a submarine? A tank? Self-propelling cars? Parachutes? Diving suits? The man was sketching helicopters in the 1490s. Helicopters! It would be another 400 years before anyone actually built one, but Leonardo had the basic concept down. Now, we need to be clear about something. Leonardo wasn't a modern scientist in the way we understand that term. He didn't do controlled experiments with proper methodology. He didn't publish his findings. He didn't engage with a scientific community, mostly because that community didn't really exist yet. But he was practicing something very close to the scientific method. He observed phenomena, formed hypotheses, tested them when he could, and revised his thinking based on what he found. He believed that knowledge should come from direct observation, not from authority. He wrote, "Anyone who conducts an argument by appealing to authority is not using his intelligence. He is just using his memory." This was radical stuff in an age when Aristotle's word was basically law. Let's talk about his anatomical work for a minute, because this is where Leonardo's observational skills really shine. He dissected human corpses, which was technically illegal but tolerated if you had the right connections, and he did it not just to understand what the body looked like, but how it worked. He drew the bones, the muscles, the organs, the blood vessels, all with incredible precision. His anatomical drawings are still used in medical schools today. They're that accurate and that beautiful. He was one of the first people to correctly depict the human spine with its natural curves. He drew the fetus in the womb. He studied the heart and came remarkably close to understanding how blood circulation works, about a century before William Harvey actually figured it out. But anatomy was just one of Leonardo's obsessions. He was equally fascinated by water. He filled pages and pages of his notebooks with drawings of water flowing, splashing, swirling, creating vortices and eddies and waves. He understood intuitively things about fluid dynamics that wouldn't be mathematically formalized until centuries later. He designed systems for draining swamps and diverting rivers. He planned canals. He thought about hydroelectric power, though obviously he didn't call it that. Water for Leonardo was alive, dynamic, full of lessons about nature and mathematics and engineering. And mathematics. Leonardo loved mathematics, even though by his own admission he wasn't particularly good at it in a formal sense. Remember, he'd never been to university. He'd never had proper training in geometry or arithmetic beyond basic calculations. But during his Milan years, he became friends with Luca Pacioli, a mathematician who wrote a book called De Divina Proportione, the Divine Proportion, about the golden ratio. Leonardo did the illustrations for this book, beautiful geometric drawings of polyhedra and other shapes. Through Pacioli, Leonardo deepened his understanding of mathematics, and he became particularly obsessed with geometry. He tried to square the circle, which is impossible, but he didn't know that. He filled pages with geometric doodles and calculations. He loved the elegance of mathematics, the way it could describe the world. In 1499, everything fell apart. The French invaded Milan, and Ludovico Sforza fled. Leonardo's comfortable position disappeared overnight. He wandered for a while, spending time in Mantua and Venice, before returning to Florence around 1500. He was approaching 50, which in the 1500s made him practically elderly, and he'd been away from Florence for nearly 2 decades. The city had changed. A young artist named Michelangelo was making a name for himself, and there was definitely some rivalry there. Leonardo thought Michelangelo was too rough, too focused on anatomical showing off. Michelangelo thought Leonardo was all talk and no finish, which, fair point. Back in Florence, Leonardo actually managed to complete a few things. Well, complete might be too strong a word, but he worked on them substantially. He painted the Virgin and Child with Saint Anne, though he kept fiddling with it for years. He did various studies and portraits. And then, around 1503 or 1504, he began work on a painting that would become possibly the most famous painting in the entire world. The portrait of Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a Florentine merchant named Francesco del Giocondo. We know this painting as Mona Lisa, or in Italian, La Gioconda. Now, Mona Lisa is so famous, so iconic, so endlessly reproduced and parodied and referenced that it's hard to see it clearly anymore. We've all seen it a million times. We know about the mysterious smile. We know it's supposed to be great, but why? What makes this particular portrait of this particular nobody? And, let's be honest, Lisa Gherardini was a nobody. What makes it so special? First, the technique. Leonardo used sfumato, which is Italian for smoky, a technique of building up extremely thin layers of translucent paint to create soft, almost imperceptible transitions between colors and tones. There are no hard edges in Mona Lisa. Everything blends. This is why her smile is so enigmatic. The corners of her mouth are suggested rather than defined, so depending on where you look and how the light hits the painting, she seems to be expressing different emotions. She's smiling. She's not smiling. She's amused. She's melancholy. She's everything and nothing, all at once. Second, the composition. Leonardo positioned Lisa in front of a landscape, but he played a trick with the perspective. The horizon line on the left side is lower than the horizon line on the right side, which creates a subtle sense of movement and instability. Your eye can't quite rest. And Lisa herself sits in this perfect three-quarter pose, her hands folded, her gaze meeting ours directly. She's present. She's real. She's looking at us across 500 years, and we can't look away. Leonardo worked on Mona Lisa for years. He took it with him everywhere. He kept revising it, adding layers, adjusting tones, perfecting that smile. He never delivered it to Francesco del Giocondo. He never sold it. It was his perpetual work in progress, his meditation on portraiture and beauty and the human face. This was Leonardo at his most Leonardo. Obsessive, perfectionist, never satisfied, always seeing something else that needed work. During these Florentine years, Leonardo also got involved in one of the great artistic disasters of the Renaissance. The city government commissioned him and Michelangelo to paint competing battle scenes on opposite walls of the council hall in the Palazzo Vecchio. This was supposed to be the ultimate showdown, the old master versus the young hotshot, Leonardo versus Michelangelo, experience versus energy. The art world was salivating. This was going to be epic. Leonardo chose to depict the Battle of Anghiari, a Florentine victory from 1440. He designed this incredible composition full of horses and soldiers in violent, swirling motion. There are preliminary sketches and copies that show what he planned, and it looks amazing, full of energy and movement and raw power. But then, Leonardo being Leonardo, he decided to experiment with technique. Instead of fresco, he tried an experimental method involving oil and heat that he'd read about in some ancient text. And it failed. Spectacularly. The paint started running down the wall. The whole thing was a disaster. Leonardo gave up and left town. Michelangelo never even started his wall. The project was abandoned. The sketches and copies are all we have, tantalizing hints of what might have been the greatest artistic showdown in history. Around 1506, Leonardo left Florence and ended up back in Milan for a while, then Rome, never staying anywhere too long, always restless. By this point, he was in his 60s, and his fortunes had become somewhat precarious. He needed a patron, someone who would support him and let him pursue his interests without worrying about money or commissions he'd never finish. And he found one in the most unlikely of places, France. King Francis, the First of France, was young, energetic, and absolutely obsessed with Italian culture. He wanted to bring the Renaissance to France, and what better way than to import an actual Renaissance genius? In 1516, when Leonardo was 64, Francis invited him to France, offering him a generous pension and a manor house near the royal chateau of Amboise. Leonardo accepted. He packed up his belongings, including Mona Lisa and his notebooks, and made the journey over the Alps to France, where he would spend the last 3 years of his life. In France, Leonardo was treated like royalty. Francis called him mon père, my father, and supposedly visited him frequently. Leonardo didn't paint much, if at all. By this point, his right hand was partially paralyzed, possibly from a stroke, though he could still draw with his left. Mostly, he spent his time organizing his notes, drawing, thinking, and talking with Francis about art and science and engineering, and everything else that fascinated him. He designed an elaborate mechanical lion that could walk forward and open its chest to reveal lilies, a symbol of France. He planned a new palace and garden for Francis, full of hydraulic systems and architectural marvels. Most of these projects remained on paper, but that was fine. Leonardo was past the point of needing to prove anything to anyone. Leonardo da Vinci died on May 2nd, 1519, at the age of 67, in his manor house at Clos-Lucé. There's a legend that he died in the arms of King Francis, which is almost certainly not true because Francis was somewhere else at the time. But again, it's too good a story to let facts completely ruin it. He was buried in a church at Amboise, though his remains were later lost during the French Revolution, because apparently Europe just can't let this man rest even in death. So what did Leonardo leave behind? Well, he completed maybe 15 paintings in his entire life, and several of those are disputed or unfinished. He never published his scientific observations. His notebooks were scattered and lost for centuries. His inventions weren't built. His anatomical discoveries were unknown until his drawings were rediscovered in the 18th century. By conventional measures of success, Leonardo was kind of a failure. He started more than he finished. He promised more than he delivered. He wandered from patron to patron, project to project, never quite settling, never quite satisfied. And yet we're still talking about him 500 years later. We're still looking at Mona Lisa and trying to figure out that smile. We're still marveling at his notebooks, those incredible pages of observation and imagination. We're still struck by his range, his curiosity, his refusal to accept easy answers or conventional wisdom. Leonardo didn't just paint pictures or design buildings. He asked fundamental questions about how the world works. How does the eye see? How do muscles move? Why does water swirl? What makes something beautiful? Leonardo represents something important about human potential. He shows us what's possible when someone refuses to stay in their lane, when they insist on connecting different fields of knowledge, when they trust their own observations over received authority. He was an artist who studied anatomy, an engineer who painted, a scientist who designed pageants. He didn't see these as separate activities. For Leonardo, it was all one thing: understanding the world. His observational skills were extraordinary. He looked at things with an intensity and attention that most of us can't sustain for 5 minutes. He could watch water flowing and see principles of physics. He could observe a bird in flight and imagine human flight. He could study a face and capture not just its appearance but its psychology. This ability to really see, to look past surfaces to underlying principles, this was Leonardo's genius. But Leonardo also represents something else: the danger of perfectionism, of never being satisfied, of letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. How many projects did he abandon because they weren't quite right? How many ideas stayed locked in his notebooks because he wanted to understand them completely before moving forward? There's a balance to be struck between Leonardo's insatiable curiosity and the practical need to actually finish things, and Leonardo never found that balance. He lived on the curiosity side, always asking one more question, always seeing one more thing to explore. His scientific work, when it was finally discovered and published, influenced later scientists and engineers. His paintings influenced every artist who came after him. His notebooks inspired countless inventors and thinkers. But perhaps more importantly, Leonardo inspired a way of thinking about the world. He showed that art and science weren't separate domains, but different ways of exploring the same reality. He demonstrated that careful observation and creative imagination could work together, that you didn't have to choose between analyzing the world and creating beauty. Let's talk about some of Leonardo's specific inventions and ideas, because they're fascinating and they reveal how his mind worked. He designed a flying machine based on his observations of birds and bats. It wouldn't have worked, the materials and power sources didn't exist to make it practical, but the principles were sound. He understood that flight required both lift and propulsion, and he tried to figure out how to achieve both. He designed a parachute, drawing a pyramid-shaped device with a wooden frame covered in linen. In 2000, someone actually built Leonardo's parachute design and jumped from a hot air balloon with it. It worked. 500 years later, and Leonardo's design worked. He designed an armored vehicle, basically a tank, that was propelled by men turning cranks inside. It had cannons pointing in all directions and sloped armor to deflect enemy fire. It wouldn't have been practical, too slow and hard to steer, but again the concept was there. He designed a self-propelled cart that worked like a giant wind-up toy, using springs for power. He designed a diving suit made of leather with a breathing tube connected to a floating bell. He designed canal locks, ball bearings, and a continuously variable transmission. Some of these ideas were refinements of existing concepts, but many were entirely original. His anatomical work deserves more attention. Leonardo dissected about 30 human corpses over his lifetime, meticulously drawing what he found. He was one of the first to correctly depict the curvature of the spine. He drew the muscles of the face with incredible accuracy, showing how they worked together to create expressions. He studied the heart and came close to understanding circulation. He drew the blood vessels throughout the body. He examined the eye and tried to understand how vision works. His goal wasn't just to draw the body, but to understand it as a machine, to see how all the parts work together. He was also interested in how the human form related to mathematics and geometry. His famous Vitruvian Man drawing, which shows a male figure with arms and legs extended fitting inside both a circle and a square, was based on the writings of the ancient Roman architect Vitruvius, who claimed that the proportions of the human body reflected divine proportions. Leonardo tested this claim, measuring and calculating, and created this iconic image that's now on everything from textbooks to t-shirts. It's become a symbol of the relationship between humanity and mathematics, between the body and the cosmos. Leonardo's interest in optics led him to study how light behaves, how it reflects and refracts, how shadows form. He understood that the eye doesn't send out rays to see objects, as some ancient theories claimed, but receives light from objects. He studied atmospheric perspective, the way distant objects appear hazier and bluer than close objects, and he used this knowledge in his paintings. The mysterious landscape behind Mona Lisa demonstrates his understanding of atmospheric perspective perfectly. Those mountains in the background fade into blue mist, creating a sense of vast distance. His botanical studies were equally detailed. He drew plants with scientific accuracy, but also with an artist's eye for beauty. He understood that plants grow in response to light, and that their structure follows mathematical patterns. He noticed that leaves are arranged on stems in specific patterns to maximize light exposure. He drew trees and flowers and studied how they grow, how they move in wind, how water flows through them. Water, as I mentioned earlier, was a particular obsession. Leonardo understood that water was essential to life and engineering. He designed elaborate systems for controlling water, for irrigation, for drainage, for powering mills. He studied erosion and sedimentation. He observed how water creates vortices and eddies and tried to understand the mathematics behind these patterns. He saw connections between the flow of water and the flow of air, between currents in rivers and currents in the atmosphere. He was thinking in terms of fluid dynamics centuries before that field existed. His artistic technique was revolutionary in multiple ways. Beyond sfumato, which we discussed, Leonardo pioneered the use of chiaroscuro, the dramatic contrast between light and dark. His paintings have a sculptural quality, with figures emerging from shadows into light. He understood anatomy so well that his figures look anatomically correct, even when they're doing impossible things. He could paint fabric so it looked real enough to touch, capturing the weight and texture of different materials. But Leonardo was also thinking about psychological realism. His figures aren't just anatomically correct, they're psychologically present. Look at Lady with an Ermine, a portrait of Cecilia Gallerani, one of Ludovico Sforza's mistresses. She's holding a white ermine, and the way her hand curves around the animal, the turn of her head, the alertness in her eyes, it all suggests a moment captured from life, a real person in a real moment. This was unusual for portraiture of the time, which tended toward stiffness and formality. Leonardo's influence on later artists was enormous. His students and followers spread his techniques throughout Europe. The Milanese school of painting was basically founded on Leonardo's style. Artists studied his works and tried to understand his methods. Raphael was influenced by Leonardo's compositions and his use of sfumato. Even Michelangelo, despite their rivalry, was influenced by Leonardo's studies of anatomy and movement. The entire development of European art was shaped by Leonardo's innovations. But we should also acknowledge Leonardo's limitations and failures. His experimental techniques often didn't work. The Last Supper started deteriorating almost immediately. His battle scene in Florence was a disaster. Many of his inventions couldn't have functioned with the technology available. His understanding of some scientific principles was wrong. He believed, for example, that the Earth was a living organism, with water flowing through it like blood through a body. This was poetic but incorrect. He also had blind spots. Despite his careful observations, he made mistakes. He thought fossils of sea creatures found in mountains were left there by the biblical flood, not understanding geological time and tectonic uplift. He believed in astrology, though to be fair, so did almost everyone in his time. He accepted some ancient authorities uncritically while rejecting others. He was brilliant, but not infallible, a genius, but still a product of his time. And then there's the question of his sexuality. Leonardo never married. He had no known romantic relationships with women. He surrounded himself with beautiful young male assistants and students. He was twice accused of sodomy, though the charges were dropped. Historians have debated for centuries whether Leonardo was gay, with some insisting he was celibate and others pointing to the obvious evidence that he preferred the company of men. By modern standards, Leonardo was almost certainly gay or bisexual, but applying modern categories to historical figures is always tricky. What we can say is that Leonardo lived outside conventional norms in this aspect of his life as in so many others. His most famous student and companion was Francesco Melzi, a young nobleman who joined Leonardo's household around 1506 when Melzi was about 14 or 15. Melzi stayed with Leonardo for the rest of Leonardo's life, traveled with him to France, and inherited Leonardo's notebooks and papers when Leonardo died. Melzi clearly loved Leonardo deeply, writing after his death about the passionate sorrow he felt at losing such a father. Whether their relationship was sexual, paternal, or something else entirely, we can't know. What's clear is that it was emotionally intimate and important to both of them. Let's talk about Leonardo's notebooks a bit more, because they're really the best way to understand how his mind worked. He filled thousands of pages, somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000, though only about 2/3 survive today. He wrote about everything: mechanics, optics, anatomy, botany, geology, mathematics, painting, architecture, weaponry, water, birds, horses, human proportions, jokes, fables, shopping lists, reminders to himself, drafts of letters, philosophical musings, everything. The notebooks weren't organized. Leonardo just wrote whatever he was thinking about at the moment, which means a page might contain a drawing of a heart next to a sketch for a flying machine, next to some calculations about church bells, next to a reminder to buy eggs. It's chaotic and brilliant, a direct window into an extraordinary mind at work. Reading through the notebooks, you get a sense of Leonardo's relentless curiosity, his inability to see something without wanting to understand it completely. He asked endless questions, scribbling them in margins. Why doesn't the moon fall? How does the tongue of a woodpecker work? What causes the expansion of water when it freezes? Can you create perpetual motion? Why is the sky blue? Some of these questions he tried to answer through observation and experiment. Others remained questions, prompts for future investigation. The asking itself was important to Leonardo. Questions were the engine of understanding. His drawings in the notebooks are extraordinary. They're not just illustrations, they're thinking tools. Leonardo drew to understand. He'd draw the same object from multiple angles, showing it in cross-section, showing how it moved or functioned. His mechanical drawings show gears and levers and pulleys with perfect clarity. His anatomical drawings show layers of muscle and bone. His botanical drawings show the structure of plants. Drawing, for Leonardo, was a way of seeing, a method of investigation. But the notebooks also reveal Leonardo's limitations as a scientist. He didn't organize his findings. He didn't publish. He didn't share his discoveries with others who might build on them. He worked in isolation, following his own interests without any larger program or plan. His scientific work was personal, almost private. This meant that many of his discoveries were lost or forgotten, only to be rediscovered by others centuries later. The notebooks weren't published until the late 1800s, nearly 400 years after Leonardo's death. Imagine if Leonardo had been able to share his anatomical discoveries with contemporary physicians. Imagine if his insights into mechanics and engineering had been available to other inventors. The course of scientific history might have been different. But Leonardo wasn't interested in sharing. He was interested in knowing, in understanding, and that was enough for him. This is simultaneously admirable, this pure love of knowledge for its own sake, and frustrating, this hoarding of insights that could have helped others. Leonardo's legacy is complicated by this tension between his private genius and public achievement. He painted fewer than 20 paintings, most of them unfinished or deteriorated. He built almost nothing. He published nothing. He left behind notebooks that weren't deciphered for centuries. And yet his impact on human culture is immeasurable. Mona Lisa alone is probably the most recognizable painting in the world. The Last Supper, despite its terrible condition, remains one of the most powerful religious images ever created. His drawing of Vitruvian Man is an icon of Renaissance thought. His inventions, even the ones that didn't work, inspire engineers and inventors today. Part of Leonardo's appeal is that he represents unfulfilled potential. We look at his notebooks and see glimpses of genius, ideas that were centuries ahead of their time, and we wonder, what if he'd finished more? What if he'd published? What if he'd focused? There's something poignant about Leonardo's scattered legacy, all these brilliant fragments that never coalesced into a complete system. He's like a Beethoven who only wrote sketches, a Shakespeare who only wrote first drafts. The potential was there, and we can see it, but it was never fully realized. But maybe that's not the right way to think about Leonardo. Maybe completion and publication and systematic organization aren't the only measures of achievement. Maybe Leonardo's true achievement was the way he lived, the way he approached the world with endless curiosity and wonder. He looked at everything as worthy of attention, from the largest structures of the cosmos to the smallest details of a leaf. He refused to separate art from science, beauty from understanding, observation from imagination. He lived according to his own interests and passions, regardless of what society expected or what would bring him fame or fortune. In one of his notebooks, Leonardo wrote, "I have been impressed with the urgency of doing. Knowing is not enough, we must apply. Being willing is not enough, we must do." This is ironic coming from a man who left so many things undone, but it also reveals Leonardo's values. Action, for Leonardo, meant observation, investigation, drawing, thinking. He was always doing, even when he wasn't producing finished works. His doing was mental and visual rather than material, but it was doing nonetheless. Leonardo believed that painting was a science, that it required understanding of geometry, anatomy, optics, and natural philosophy. He wrote a treatise on painting, or rather, he wrote notes toward a treatise that his students later compiled and organized. In it, he argued that painting was superior to poetry and music because it could capture the visible world with perfect accuracy, showing things as they actually appeared. This was a bold claim in an age when the liberal arts, things like grammar and rhetoric and philosophy, were considered superior to mechanical arts like painting and sculpture. But Leonardo was insistent. Painting required knowledge and intelligence, not just manual skill. A painter had to understand perspective, proportion, anatomy, light, color, composition. A painter had to know how muscles worked, how fabric draped, how light reflected off different surfaces. A painter had to understand human psychology to capture emotion in a face. Painting, for Leonardo, was applied knowledge, the visual expression of understanding. It was science made visible. This is why Leonardo spent so much time on his scientific investigations. He wasn't being distracted from painting. He was doing the work that made great painting possible. Every hour spent studying anatomy was an investment in painting better bodies. Every observation of water was preparation for painting better landscapes. Every investigation of optics improved his understanding of how to depict light and shadow. It was all connected. Leonardo's understanding of light was particularly sophisticated. He knew that light travels in straight lines. He understood reflection and refraction. He observed that shadows aren't uniformly dark, but contain reflected light from surrounding surfaces. He noticed that colored objects cast colored shadows. He studied the behavior of light passing through water, through glass, through air. All of this knowledge went into his paintings. The subtle modeling of faces in his portraits, the way light seems to glow from within his figures, the atmospheric effects in his landscapes. All of this was based on careful observation and understanding of optical principles. He also thought deeply about color. He understood that colors appear different depending on lighting conditions and surrounding colors. He knew that distant objects appear cooler and bluer due to atmospheric scattering of light. He experimented with pigments, trying to create colors that were stable and luminous. His palette was relatively limited compared to later painters, but he used it with incredible sophistication, building up layers of translucent color to create subtle effects that still mystify conservators today. Leonardo was also interested in architecture, though he never built a complete building. He designed churches, fortifications, villas, city plans. His architectural drawings show his engineering mind at work. He thought about structure, about how weight is distributed, about how spaces flow into one another. He designed an ideal city with multiple levels, with canals for transportation and waste removal, with wide streets and good sanitation. This was visionary urban planning for the late 1400s. Cities at that time were cramped, filthy, disease-ridden. Leonardo imagined something better, a rational, healthy, beautiful city based on principles of geometry and hygiene. His military engineering was similarly forward-thinking. He designed fortifications that could resist cannon fire, with sloped walls to deflect projectiles. He designed giant crossbows, steam cannons, multiple-barreled guns. Many of these weapons couldn't have actually worked with available technology, but they show Leonardo thinking about the problems of warfare. How to project force, how to defend against attack, how to move troops and supplies. Some of his defensive designs were actually quite practical and influenced later military architecture. But Leonardo also seems to have had mixed feelings about warfare. In his notebooks, he wrote about a submarine design, but then noted that he wouldn't publish the details because he feared men would use it to sink ships and drown sailors. He designed terrible weapons but seemed uncomfortable with their implications. This tension between intellectual curiosity and moral concern runs through his work. He wanted to understand everything, but he wasn't naive about how knowledge could be used. Let's return to his paintings for a moment and look at some of the lesser-known works. Lady with an Ermine, which I mentioned earlier, is a stunning portrait painted around 1489 or 1490. Cecilia Gallerani is shown in three-quarter view. Her body turned one way, her head turned another, creating a sense of movement and alertness. She's holding a white ermine, which was a symbol of purity, but also a pun on the Greek word for ermine, which sounds like Gallerani. Leonardo loved this kind of clever visual wordplay. The painting shows his mastery of portraiture. Cecilia is beautiful but also intelligent, alert, present. She's not just a pretty face, but a person with thoughts and personality. The Virgin of the Rocks exists in two versions, one in the Louvre and one in London's National Gallery, and art historians love to argue about which one Leonardo painted more of and which one his assistants did. Both show the Virgin Mary, the infant Jesus, the infant John the Baptist, and an angel in a rocky grotto with strange geological formations in the background. The compositions are pyramidal, with Mary at the apex, creating a stable but dynamic arrangement. The lighting is mysterious, seeming to come from multiple sources. The figures are arranged in a complex pattern of gestures and glances that connect them psychologically and compositionally. The London version is generally considered less successful, more rigid, possibly more the work of assistants. But the Louvre version is extraordinary. The rocks in the background aren't just decorative. They're geologically accurate formations showing Leonardo's knowledge of erosion and sedimentation. The plants in the foreground are botanically precise. The angel pointing toward John the Baptist creates a connection between figures. Mary's hand hovering protectively over Jesus creates another. The whole composition is like a carefully choreographed dance, every element in its perfect place. Saint John the Baptist is one of Leonardo's last paintings, probably done in France in his final years. It shows John emerging from darkness, one hand raised in blessing, the other holding a cross, his face turned toward the viewer with an enigmatic smile that recalls Mona Lisa. The painting is deeply ambiguous. John is traditionally shown as an ascetic, wild-haired, and serious. Leonardo's John is sensuous, almost feminine, smiling mysteriously. The painting makes people uncomfortable, which might have been Leonardo's intention. It challenges assumptions about sacred art, about masculinity, about the nature of holiness. Leonardo's drawings are artworks in themselves. His studies for the adoration of the Magi show his compositional process, how he worked out complex arrangements of figures. His anatomical studies are beautiful as well as scientifically accurate, showing the human body as both mechanism and miracle. His drawings of horses show these animals in every possible pose and angle. His botanical drawings capture the specific character of different plants. His caricatures and grotesque heads show his interest in physiognomy and the outer limits of human appearance. Some are funny, some are disturbing. All are observed with relentless accuracy. He drew constantly. Drawing was how he thought, how he explored, how he understood. Many of his drawings are studies for paintings that were never completed, leaving us with beautiful fragments, glimpses of what might have been. There's a famous drawing of a young woman, possibly a study for an angel, done in metal point on prepared paper. It's one of the most beautiful drawings ever made, showing Leonardo's ability to capture life in a few delicate lines. Her face is serene, her expression gentle. You feel you could reach out and touch her. The range of Leonardo's interests sometimes seems overwhelming. How could one person be deeply interested in so many different things? How did he find time for all of it? Part of the answer is that Leonardo didn't sleep much. He practiced polyphasic sleep, taking short naps throughout the day rather than sleeping for long stretches at night. This gave him more waking hours to pursue his investigations. Whether this was healthy is debatable, but it definitely gave him more time. He was also famously indifferent to food. He'd eat whatever was available without much attention to taste or pleasure. He was vegetarian, unusual for his time, possibly for ethical reasons. He reportedly would buy caged birds in the market just to set them free, showing a compassion for animals that extended to his diet. This simplicity in eating and sleeping freed up time and mental energy for more interesting pursuits. Leonardo's appearance is mostly guesswork. We have no confirmed portraits of him from his lifetime. The famous image we think of, the old man with the long beard and wise eyes, comes from a drawing attributed to Leonardo himself, though even this attribution is debated. Various other images might be Leonardo, or might be someone else, or might be Leonardo's imagination. We do know from contemporary descriptions that he was handsome, that he dressed well, that he was strong enough to bend horseshoes with his bare hands, and that he had a beautiful singing voice. He was, by all accounts, physically impressive and charismatic. His personality is also somewhat mysterious. He seems to have been reserved, private, slow to form close attachments. He had students and assistants, but few equals. He moved in the highest circles, dining with dukes and kings, but he maintained his independence. He could be charming when he wanted to be, but he could also be aloof. He had a sharp wit and wasn't afraid to criticize others, including powerful patrons. He once wrote a sarcastic letter to some monks who were complaining that he hadn't finished their altarpiece, pointing out that if they'd paid him properly, he might have been more motivated. But he could also be generous. He supported various members of his household who weren't contributing much. He took in students who showed promise. He shared his knowledge with those who were interested, teaching them his techniques and methods. He just didn't broadcast his discoveries to the world. His generosity was personal rather than public. Leonardo's influence extended far beyond his own lifetime. His notebooks, when they were finally published, inspired countless scientists and inventors. His paintings set standards for artistic excellence that are still relevant today. His approach to knowledge, combining observation, imagination, and reason, became a model for later thinkers. The idea of the polymath, the person with broad knowledge across multiple domains, owes much to Leonardo's example. But we should be careful about making Leonardo into a superhero or a modern scientist avant la lettre. He was a person of his time, with his time's limitations and blind spots. He believed things that were wrong. He accepted authorities when he shouldn't have. He made mistakes. His notebooks are full of failed experiments and incorrect hypotheses. His inventions mostly didn't work. His understanding of many scientific principles was incomplete or inaccurate. He was brilliant, but he wasn't omniscient. What made Leonardo special wasn't that he was always right. It was that he was always curious, always willing to look and think and question. He had the courage to trust his own observations, even when they contradicted received wisdom. He had the discipline to pursue his investigations with rigor and care. And he had the vision to see connections between different domains of knowledge, to understand that everything is connected to everything else. This holistic view of knowledge is part of what makes Leonardo feel so modern. We live in an age of specialization, where people know more and more about less and less. Leonardo went in the opposite direction, knowing something about everything. He refused to be confined to a single discipline or domain. He was an artist, engineer, scientist, anatomist, architect, mathematician, musician, inventor, philosopher, and he saw no contradiction in combining all these roles. They were all ways of understanding and engaging with the world. The tragedy is that Leonardo's holistic approach didn't survive him. As knowledge expanded and became more complex, specialization became necessary. No one person could master all of human knowledge anymore. The Renaissance ideal of universal knowledge gave way to the modern reality of disciplinary boundaries. We gained depth but lost breadth. We know more as a species, but each individual knows less about the totality of knowledge. Leonardo represents a lost possibility, a road not taken, a way of being in the world that's no longer viable but remains attractive. Still, Leonardo's example continues to inspire people to cross boundaries, to connect different fields, to refuse narrow specialization. Steve Jobs famously said that Apple succeeded by standing at the intersection of technology and liberal arts, combining engineering with design. That's a Leonardo move. Scientists who write poetry, artists who study neuroscience, musicians who program computers, these are Leonardo's spiritual descendants, people who refuse to be confined to a single domain. Leonardo's notebooks also inspired a tradition of keeping personal notebooks, of recording observations and ideas and questions. Many scientists and artists and writers have kept Leonardo-style notebooks, filling them with drawings and notes and thoughts. The practice of externalizing thinking, of using writing and drawing as tools for understanding, this owes something to Leonardo's example. His anatomical work eventually influenced medicine, though not until centuries after his death. When his drawings were finally published in the 19th century, physicians were amazed at their accuracy. Here was someone in the 1500s who had understood human anatomy better than most doctors in the 1800s. Leonardo's careful observation and precise drawing had captured details that weren't rediscovered until modern times. His engineering drawings influenced inventors and engineers. His flying machines inspired aviation pioneers. His weapons designs influenced military engineers. His architectural plans influenced urban designers. The fact that many of his inventions couldn't have worked with available technology doesn't diminish their importance as imaginative leaps, as visions of what might be possible. His paintings continue to set standards for artistic excellence. Art students still study his compositions, his use of light and shadow, his understanding of anatomy, his psychological insight. Mona Lisa and The Last Supper are touchstones of Western art, images that everyone knows, that have entered the collective visual consciousness. They've been reproduced, parodied, analyzed, and celebrated so much that it's hard to see them fresh. But they reward sustained attention. The more you look, the more you see. Mona Lisa, in particular, has become more than a painting. It's a cultural icon, a symbol of artistic genius, a test case for theories about beauty and meaning. Why is she smiling? What is she thinking? Who was she really? The questions never stop, which is appropriate for a painting by a man who never stopped asking questions. The painting's fame is partly due to its quality, but also to historical accidents. It was stolen in 1911, which made it internationally famous. It was exhibited around the world, building its reputation. It became a symbol of French culture, then of European culture, then of high culture generally. Now it's the most valuable painting in the world, insured for hundreds of millions of dollars, protected by bulletproof glass in the Louvre, viewed by millions of people every year. Most of those people see it for about 15 seconds before being pushed along by the crowd. They take a selfie with it in the background and move on. They can say they've seen Mona Lisa, but have they really? Have they noticed the delicate sfumato, the impossible landscape, the subtle asymmetries, the psychological presence? Probably not, but that's okay. Mona Lisa has become bigger than itself. It's a pilgrimage site, a bucket list item, a cultural marker. You go to see it because you're supposed to, because it's there, because it's Mona Lisa. The actual experience of looking at the painting is almost beside the point. This is unfortunate, but perhaps inevitable. Great art becomes encrusted with cultural baggage. It becomes difficult to see what's actually there because of everything we bring to it. Leonardo's paintings suffer from this more than most. They're too famous, too celebrated, too analyzed. We need to actively work to see them fresh, to look past the fame and the reproductions and the cultural associations to the actual painted surface, the actual arrangement of pigment on panel or wall. When we can do that, when we can really look, Leonardo's genius becomes visible again. Let's consider Leonardo's relationship with his patrons, because this shaped his career in important ways. He needed patrons. Artists in the Renaissance couldn't survive without them. There was no market for art in the modern sense. You didn't create paintings and hope someone would buy them. You waited for a commission from a church, a government, or a wealthy individual, and then you fulfilled that commission. Or, in Leonardo's case, you started to fulfill it, and then got distracted by something else. His patrons must have found him frustrating. They'd commission a painting and get excuses about why it wasn't done. They'd hire him for one thing, and he'd spend his time on something else. They'd expect conventional results and get experimental techniques that didn't work. But they kept hiring him anyway, because even when Leonardo didn't finish things, even when he wandered off to pursue some other interest, what he did produce was extraordinary. His partial achievement was worth more than most artists' complete works. Ludovico Sforza in Milan supported Leonardo for nearly 2 decades, which shows remarkable patience. Yes, Leonardo provided other services, engineering advice, theatrical productions, and whatnot, but still, Ludovico could have fired him at any point. He didn't, because Leonardo was valuable even when he was difficult. Francis I of France showed similar patience, supporting Leonardo in his final years when Leonardo was producing very little. These patrons recognized genius, even when that genius came with significant challenges. Leonardo's relationship with money was complicated. He earned well when he was working, but he seems to have been indifferent to wealth accumulation. He didn't save money. He didn't invest in property. He supported various hangers-on and students. He spent money on books, on instruments, on materials for experiments. He lived comfortably but not lavishly. Money was a means to an end, enabling him to pursue his interests, not an end in itself. This attitude toward money was relatively unusual for his time. Most successful artists were quite interested in accumulating wealth and status. Michelangelo died rich. Raphael lived in a palace. Leonardo died comfortable but not wealthy, supported by a generous pension from Francis but without much accumulated capital. He didn't seem to care. He had what he needed: time, materials, and the freedom to pursue his interests. Let's talk about some of Leonardo's specific scientific observations and how close he came to modern understanding. His study of the heart is particularly interesting. He observed the 4 chambers of the heart and understood that the heart was a pump. He studied the valves and tried to understand how they worked. He understood that blood flowed through the heart in a specific pattern. He was wrong about some things. He thought blood was produced in the liver and consumed by the body rather than circulating continuously. But he was remarkably close to understanding circulation, about a century before William Harvey actually figured it out. His studies of bird flight were similarly prescient. He understood that birds create lift by having wings shaped so that air flows faster over the top surface than the bottom surface, creating lower pressure above the wing. This is basically correct, though he didn't have the mathematical framework to fully explain it. He observed that birds don't just flap their wings up and down, but twist them in complex ways to control direction and speed. He noticed that birds use their tails as rudders. All of this observation went into his designs for flying machines. His flying machines couldn't have worked, at least not with human power, because humans can't generate enough power relative to their weight to sustain flight by flapping wings. But Leonardo didn't know this. He was working from observation and analogy, reasoning that if birds could fly by flapping wings, humans should be able to do the same with appropriately designed artificial wings. The logic was sound even if the physics didn't work out. It would take another 400 years and the invention of the internal combustion engine before human flight became possible, but Leonardo had the right idea. His geological observations were ahead of his time. He understood that fossils of sea creatures found in mountains were actual remains of ancient sea life, not just rocks that happened to look like shells. He reasoned that the land must have been underwater at some point and then risen, or the sea must have been higher. This was correct, though he didn't understand plate tectonics or the vast timescales involved. Most people in his time thought fossils were either jokes of nature or relics of Noah's flood. Leonardo looked at the evidence and drew rational conclusions. He studied erosion and understood that rivers cut into rock over time, creating valleys. He observed sediment layers and understood that they represented different periods of deposition. He was, in a very real sense, practicing geology before geology existed as a discipline. His observations were scattered through his notebooks, mixed with everything else, but they represented genuine scientific insights. His botanical observations were similarly advanced. He understood phototropism, the tendency of plants to grow toward light. He observed that leaves are arranged to maximize light exposure while minimizing overlap. He studied tree rings and understood that they indicated years of growth. He dissected plants to understand their structure. He drew them with scientific accuracy. Again, this was science before science, careful observation leading to understanding. But Leonardo's scientific method, if we can call it that, had limitations. He didn't do controlled experiments in the modern sense. He didn't measure things precisely. He didn't develop mathematical theories to explain his observations. He didn't publish his results or engage with a community of fellow investigators. His science was personal, observational, qualitative rather than quantitative. This was typical for his time, but it meant that his insights remained private and didn't contribute to the collective advancement of knowledge until centuries after his death. Still, Leonardo's approach to investigation was fundamentally sound. Observe carefully, question assumptions, test ideas when possible, follow the evidence. This is the scientific method, even if Leonardo didn't formalize it or apply it systematically. He was practicing what would later be called empiricism, the idea that knowledge comes from observation and experience rather than from authority or pure reason. His rejection of authority was particularly important. The Renaissance was a period of reviving ancient texts, of rediscovering Greek and Roman knowledge. Many scholars believed that the ancients had known everything important and that modern people just needed to recover that knowledge. Leonardo rejected this. He respected the ancients but didn't worship them. He was willing to question Aristotle, Galen, Vitruvius, anyone who contradicted his observations. This was revolutionary. This was the beginning of modern science. Leonardo wrote in one of his notebooks, "He who loves practice without theory is like the sailor who boards ship without a rudder and compass and never knows where he may cast." But he also wrote, "Wisdom is the daughter of experience." These two statements capture Leonardo's approach. Theory and practice, observation and understanding, must work together. You can't just collect facts without trying to understand their meaning. You can't just develop theories without testing them against reality. You need both. This integration of theory and practice, of thinking and doing, of understanding and making, this was Leonardo's great contribution. He showed that you didn't have to choose between being a thinker and being a maker, between intellectual work and manual work. They were complementary, two aspects of the same process of engaging with the world. This was a revolutionary idea in a society that sharply divided mental and manual labor, that considered thinking superior to making. Leonardo's status as an illegitimate person actually helped him here. Because he couldn't enter the learned professions, he had to work with his hands. Because he wasn't educated in the traditional way, he had to educate himself through observation. His disadvantages became advantages, forcing him to develop new ways of knowing that turned out to be more effective than the old ways. This is a pattern we see throughout history. Outsiders often make the biggest breakthroughs because they're not constrained by conventional thinking. Leonardo was an outsider to the learned establishment, and this freed him to think differently. He couldn't rely on Latin texts because he didn't read Latin well. He couldn't appeal to ancient authorities because he hadn't been trained in them. He had to look at the world itself, and what he saw was more interesting than what the book said anyway. In his final years in France, Leonardo seems to have achieved a kind of peace. He was honored, comfortable, free to pursue his interests without pressure to produce. He spent time with Francis, discussing ideas, sharing his knowledge. He organized his notebooks, trying to bring some order to his lifetime of observations. He continued to draw and think. He probably painted very little, if at all. His hand was partially paralyzed, and he was old, tired. But his mind was still active, still curious, still seeking to understand. When he died in 1519, the Renaissance was continuing without him. New artists were rising, new ideas were spreading. The world was changing in ways Leonardo had anticipated but wouldn't live to see. The Protestant Reformation was about to shake Europe. The scientific revolution was beginning. The age of exploration was opening up new worlds. Leonardo had been part of this transformation, though his role wouldn't be fully recognized for centuries. His immediate legacy was modest. He left behind a scattered collection of paintings, some finished, most not. He left behind thousands of notebook pages that his heir, Francesco Melzi, carefully preserved but didn't publish. He left behind a reputation as a genius who couldn't finish things, a brilliant man who had somehow failed to live up to his potential. His paintings were admired, but many people thought Raphael or Michelangelo were greater artists. His scientific work was unknown. His inventions were unbuilt. He was famous, but not as famous as he would become. The notebooks were the key to Leonardo's later reputation. Melzi kept them together but didn't know what to do with them. After Melzi's death, The notebooks were scattered among various collectors. Some were lost. Some were hidden away in private collections. It wasn't until the late 18th and 19th centuries that serious efforts were made to collect, organize, and publish Leonardo's notes. And when they were finally published, the world was astounded. Here was someone from the 1500s who had anticipated discoveries that wouldn't be made for centuries. Here was someone who had studied anatomy with modern precision, who had designed helicopters and tanks and parachutes, who had understood principles of physics and engineering that were supposedly discovered later. Leonardo was suddenly revealed as not just a great painter, but a universal genius, a man ahead of his time. This created the Leonardo legend that we live with today. Leonardo, the superhuman genius, the man who knew everything, the prophet of modernity. This legend is both true and false. True in that Leonardo was extraordinarily gifted and curious and insightful. False in that it makes him seem more modern, more scientific, more systematic than he actually was. Leonardo was a man of his time who happened to be exceptionally intelligent and curious. He wasn't a time traveler from the future. He was a Renaissance artist-engineer who pushed the boundaries of knowledge in his own time and in his own way. But the legend is powerful and persistent because Leonardo represents something we want to believe about human potential. That one person can know many things, that curiosity is enough, that careful observation can unlock the secrets of nature, that genius can transcend circumstance. We want to believe this because it's inspiring, because it suggests that we too might see more, understand more, create more, if only we paid attention, if only we asked questions, if only we refused to accept easy answers. Leonardo's life also teaches us about the costs of genius. He never married, never had children, never built a stable home. He moved from place to place, patron to patron, project to project. He left things unfinished. He disappointed people. He lived, in some sense, outside normal human society, pursuing his own interests at the expense of conventional success and connection. Was he happy? It's hard to say. He seems to have been content with his choices, but there's also a sense of isolation, of distance from ordinary human concerns. His relationships were mostly with his students and assistants, young men who admired him and served him but weren't his equals. His friendships with fellow intellectuals like Luca Pacioli seem to have been more about shared interests than emotional intimacy. He was admired but perhaps not deeply known. His notebooks reveal his thoughts about nature and art and science, but very little about his feelings, his fears, his hopes. He remains in some fundamental way mysterious. This mystery is part of his appeal. We project onto Leonardo what we want to see. He becomes a mirror, reflecting our own values and aspirations. Scientists see him as a proto-scientist. Artists see him as the ultimate artist. Engineers see him as an inventor. Humanists see him as the Renaissance ideal. He's capacious enough to contain all these interpretations, which is why he remains endlessly fascinating 5 centuries after his death. But beyond the legend and the mystery, there's a real person who lived and worked and struggled and created. There's someone who got up every morning and decided what to work on, who faced frustration when things didn't work, who felt satisfaction when they did. There's someone who looked at the world with wonder and tried to capture that wonder in paint and in notebooks. There's someone who loved beauty and understanding and pursued both with equal passion. That person, the real Leonardo, is in some ways more interesting than the legend. He was brilliant but also flawed, visionary but also limited, revolutionary but also conservative. He contains contradictions, as all real people do. He was an illegitimate outsider who dined with dukes and kings. He was a vegetarian who designed terrible weapons. He was a meticulous observer who believed in astrology. He was a man who could paint the most beautiful faces but drew grotesque caricatures. He could design flying machines but couldn't finish a painting. These contradictions don't diminish Leonardo. They make him human. They remind us that genius doesn't mean perfection, that brilliance can coexist with limitations, that extraordinary gifts can come with significant challenges. Leonardo succeeded, not despite his contradictions, but through them, finding ways to turn his peculiarities into advantages, his limitations into strengths. If we were to sum up Leonardo's achievement, what would we say? He painted 15 or 20 paintings, some of them among the greatest ever created. He filled thousands of notebook pages with observations and ideas that advanced multiple fields of knowledge. He designed buildings and cities and weapons and machines, most unbuilt but some influential. He studied anatomy and botany and geology and physics and mathematics and optics and countless other subjects, making genuine contributions to human understanding, even if those contributions weren't recognized in his lifetime. But more than any specific achievement, Leonardo demonstrated a way of being in the world, a way of engaging with reality that combined rigorous observation with creative imagination, analytical thinking with artistic expression, reason with wonder. He showed that you could study the world scientifically and paint it beautifully, that these weren't contradictory activities but complementary ones, two ways of honoring the complexity and beauty of nature. He showed that curiosity is its own reward, that understanding can be its own end, that the joy of discovery doesn't require publication or recognition or practical application. He pursued knowledge for its own sake, because not knowing bothered him, because the world was endlessly fascinating, because there was always more to learn and see and understand. This pure love of knowledge, this intellectual passion, is perhaps Leonardo's greatest legacy. We live in a world that Leonardo helped create, a world where observation trumps authority, where evidence matters more than tradition, where human creativity and intelligence are celebrated and cultivated. We've gone far beyond what Leonardo knew or imagined, but we're following paths he helped clear, asking questions he first asked, combining disciplines he first combined. We stand on his shoulders, as the saying goes, seeing farther because he lifted us up, and yet something has been lost. We've gained so much knowledge that no one person can master it all anymore. We've specialized and subdivided and created narrow fields of expertise. We've become very good at knowing more and more about less and less. We've lost the breadth that Leonardo represented, the ability to move freely across domains, to see connections that specialists miss. We've lost something of the wonder, too, the sheer joy of looking at the world and marveling at its complexity. Maybe that's okay. Maybe specialization was inevitable and necessary. Maybe we've gained more than we've lost. But it's worth remembering Leonardo, worth honoring the ideal he represented, worth aspiring to a little more breadth, a little more curiosity, a little more willingness to cross boundaries and ask questions outside our expertise. We can't all be Leonardo, but we can all be a little more Leonardo-like, more observant, more curious, more willing to question, more eager to understand. As we think about Leonardo's life and work, certain images stay with us. The old man with the long beard, contemplating the mysteries of nature. The young artist painting an angel that outshines his master's work. The anatomist bent over a cadaver, drawing with meticulous precision. The engineer sketching impossible machines. The painter staring at a wall for hours, thinking, always thinking. The wanderer moving from city to city, never quite settling, always seeking something just out of reach. These images capture different aspects of Leonardo, different moments in his long and productive life. But perhaps the truest image is simply Leonardo observing something, anything, a flower, a face, a stream, with complete attention, trying to understand it fully, trying to see past surfaces to underlying principles, trying to capture in drawing or paint or words what he sees. This is Leonardo at his essence, the observer, the questioner, the seeker, the person who looks at the world and says, I want to understand this. That curiosity, that drive to understand, that refusal to accept ignorance when knowledge is possible, that's what made Leonardo who he was. That's what makes him worth studying and celebrating 500 years after his death. Good night. And in case you've enjoyed our evening talk so much and still might be awake, here is another educational video for you.